Good evening. Welcome. I'm John. I'm the event director, at Literati Bookstore. We're pleased this evening to welcome Vanessa Veselka in support of the Great Offshore Grounds in conversation with Tom Bissell. Some Zoom etiquette. As you heard me when you were connecting, you are muted and you will remain muted. Speaker view is probably going to be the ideal viewing experience for you this evening. That way you'll just see who is speaking on your screen and not a grid of names. And we do ask that you keep your camera off for the duration of the event. The chat is also closed for public chatting, but you might want to keep the chat window open throughout the event. I will be sending occasional messages with links to where you can purchase books from Literati Bookstore, and you can use the chat to send me directly any questions you might have for the Q&A at any time. So whenever the spirit moves you throughout our event, feel free to send those questions. I will read a selection of them to the authors at the conclusion of their conversation. As a reminder, you can purchase books on our website, and I'll include a link in the chat. And also, if you're watching later on YouTube, there will be a link in the description below. You can also shop for more books at literatibookstore.com. Thousands of titles are available for curbside pickup if you live in Southeast Michigan while our doors remain closed to the public. And in lieu of a book purchase, we'd also ask that you consider a $5 donation to sustain our virtual programming. So whether you'd like to think of that as a subscription for this week's events, there's 6 of them this week, or whether you'd like to think of it as a subscription for this month's events or the events remaining this year, you can make donations at literatibookstore.com/donation. Otherwise, we simply thank you for your attendance this evening or this afternoon or this morning, depending on wherever in the world you may be joining us from. So without further ado, I'll introduce our author and moderator. Vanessa Veselka is the author of the novel Zazen, which won the Penn Robert W. Bingham Prize. Her short stories have appeared in Tin House and Ziziva, and her nonfiction in GQ, The Atlantic, Smithsonian, The Atavist, and was included in the Best American Essays in the anthology Bitchfest, the 10 Years of Cultural Criticism. She has been, at various times, a teenage runaway, a sex worker, a union organizer, an independent record label owner, a train hopper, a waitress, and a mother. She lives in Portland, Oregon. And Tom Bissell was born in Escanaba, Michigan. His short fiction has won 2 Pushcart Prizes and has been published in multiple editions of the Best American Series. He has also written 8 works of nonfiction, including Apostle and with Greg Sestero, The Disaster Artist, as well as many screenplays for video games and television. He lives in Los Angeles with his family. Please join me in using your Zoom clap or heart reactions to welcome Vanessa and Tom to your living rooms.
I have no idea what a Zoom clap is.
It's the 2 little clapping hands that we're seeing on the screen right now.
Got it.
There you go.
Got it.
Yeah, it's I believe is it an emoji or
It is an emoji, I think,
or
or maybe it's not.
or it's an emoticon. There's a very subtle distinction between the two, and I'm not sure.
We are
what
too old to have this discussion.
Yes, we are.
Many
Hello, Vanessa.
Hi, Tom.
We're here to celebrate this wonderful book, and I'm going to just say the following, just to put my cards on the table right at the beginning here. Maybe you can. Well, I won't make you endure the embarrassment of rereading the texts I was sending you as I was reading this book, but it's fucking great. Congratulations on making the long list for the National Book Award. A, I'm not surprised at all. You claim to be, but you shouldn't be. B, I think I said to you when we talked on the phone recently, but I'll say it again. Some books have really great characters. Some books have beautiful sentences you want to linger with. And some books are just compulsive page turners that you just want to just keep going to see what happens. Very few books manage to do all 3 of these things. This one does. So I want to encourage everyone who's in this, I don't even know what you call these things, this digital event. I want to encourage you all, if you haven't ordered the book, please order it, and then order another one and give it to your favorite reader friend, because that's how good this book is. It's magnificent. I cannot tell you how much I loved it.
Thanks,
And
Tom.
then one more final thing. You know, when you're a writer, you meet writers and you read their books and stuff. It's a special kind of a book that erases the person you know who wrote it. And that's what this book did for me. You were erased. You just vanished. I forgot about you. And I just got sucked into it. So very briefly, we've known each other for more than a decade, I guess.
Yeah, about a decade.
About a decade. So I met you literarily when you had applied for the Portland State MFA program. And it was a day, I remember it specifically because I'd been reading manuscripts for the better part of 6 or 7 hours. And then yours came up and it just popped out at me. Number one, your name, Vanessa Veselka, just popped out at me because Veselka is a Slavic, I believe it means fork, right?
No, it doesn't mean fork. It means
What does it
rainbow,
mean?
Ukrainian.
Oh, fork,
It
rainbow.
means marriage and happiness. It's basically and a whole bunch of other things.
Or fork, one or the other. And I was like, oh, that's an interesting name, Vanessa Veselka. And then I started reading the story, and I was like, holy shit, this is good. And like, I instantly there was you just consensus formed around you that this was a student that was absolutely going to be invited to this program. And then we met, and like I remember being struck by just the huge vitality you had as a person. Like, and I thought, well, this person is obviously a writer. And then we became friends. And my absolute favorite story about you, and I tell this for the benefit of Donovan Hone, who's in the participants room, is I think we were in LA, we were on the metro, and you just mentioned offhand, oh yeah, I think I got into the cab of this serial killer once when I was hitchhiking across the country. And I was like, excuse me, what? And you just told the story, like, I think, I was in this famous serial killer's cab. I was like, have you ever written about that? And this is a direct quote. I don't think anyone would be interested in that. And I was like, well, I think they would be. And we just sort of started talking about exploring this. And you wound up writing this stunning piece called The Truck Stop Killers, which Donovan edited. And so that was, to me, like further reminder of your gifts, just this amazing life you've had. And, I now turn it over to you just to describe some of the journey that you had that brought you in preparation to start this book.
Okay. Well, when I've been asked a couple times, like, how did I end up coming to think of myself as a writer or have that identity? And I always wrote journals since I was 5. So, I was always writing. My chief skill in writing was to try to get past barriers. I wrote things to say, here's why you should let me into college when I'm 15, or here's why you should ignore the rule that I just broke, or here's why, it just like, I just used it for those kind of things. Here's why I'm past the deadline. I have no money. And yet I would still like you to consider my petition for X, right? So that was like a life skill that I had honed a lot and gotten good feedback on. But I didn't actually think of myself as a writer for real in any real way until I was a musician for years, and that was my main focus. And I wrote my first short story when I was 36 or 37 at Reed in a class there. And I think that's when I first really thought. I had done 2 nonfiction stories before, but they were kind of short, just sort of opinion pieces. And so, I started seeing it as a possibility, and in truth, in part because, I had a very, very young kid. I wasn't going to be able to tour. I was burnt out on music in a lot of ways. And I just, I could write, you know what I mean? Like it was something I could do alone by myself, in times when the kid was asleep or other things. I went to, me in school is in general not a good thing, but I did go to Reed, and I went there as an adult. I was like much, much, much older than everybody. I was the age of all the teachers, and then after I left, I was driving cab, and I was still driving cab when you and I met. I was driving night cab for a radio cab in Portland, and I thought, well, at least if I apply to an MFA, I can live on the loans until I figure out something else. And that was sort of my deep thought about that. Without going into it, as you and I both know, I was not built for that system, and it was a short trip through the academy.
Neither was I, as it turns out.
You and I, we were both like, but you were the great result of that, my friendship with you. So, yeah. I wrote Zazen. It got turned down by everybody. It's kind of the classic story. And then Richard Nash.
Who's in our chat, I believe. I saw his
name. Okay, cool. Yeah, he took a flyer on me. And then, you're the one who talked me into writing the piece with Donovan. And I remember that conversation. It wasn't just, would anybody be interested in it? It was also everything about telling that story was, I remember also saying, I don't write about myself. Like anybody who knows me at a party knows I can talk about myself like a bore, but like, so, and Donovan could also attest to the fact that it was always a thing of like, could you put a little bit more of why, what I mean? Like, so, that question of, I do love fiction best, I really do. And so, yeah, this book took 8 years, and it was really hard, and it was really emotional, and it was, many, many times I felt like maybe I was making the wrong call, like I would jumped off a cliff, that, any number of things about it. And I was talking to someone just the other day, and it's like, you can tell the story in such a way that it sounds inevitable. Like, of course it was this, and then it was that, and then it went to become this. And that's not my belief system about anything with that, because these things are by a hair's breadth a lot of times. And I think that it's, so I feel very, very fortunate. But also that was something that came up in the writing of the book, which is this question of, one of the characters is very forceful about, I don't believe things happen. Like this idea of story and who has the story and what does it mean to tell yourself, I'm in this part of the story, so the greatness is all ahead. What does it mean to say all of these things, and what stories can you believe in anymore past a certain, point? So, it is an incredible thing to see the book on the National Book Award long list.
I'll be honest, you and I talked several times over the last few years, and you came to me like in despair about this book.
Despair. Absolute despair.
Total despair. And I was trapped in despair about the book I was writing, which took 9 years at the time, which was not on the National Book Award long list or short list or any list for that matter. But I know the pain of that feeling, because you really do feel like you're in a raft in between Brazil and Africa, and you have no idea which way the wind is blowing. You just don't know.
Yeah.
And it feels that vast, and the problems feel that insurmountable. So I'm going to, tell you, like, when I saw the book was coming out and Knopf had taken it, the sister house of my publisher, I was totally excited. But I opened this with some feeling of, well, let's see how she kicked and scraped her out of this jam. I just wasn't prepared for the and this is not a diss, or this is not a backhanding. I was not prepared for the control and the artistry of this book, because at no point did you communicate that you felt at all in control of this story. So I'm curious if you could talk just very quickly about how close the book, which is about these two sisters who share a father but not a mother, and who light out upon the territory, as it were, America, to sort of discover who they are and who, what their relationship really is. And they have a brother who is an adoptee. They come from this spectacularly, gloriously fucked up family, and it's, the book just sort of embraces everything about our country and everything. Like how close the book wound up being as to what you were envisioning when you started.
Really close.
Oh, wow, that is not what I was expecting. I'm glad we didn't rehearse these answers, because I'm thinking like, oh, it totally turned into something totally different.
Well, it didn't. I mean, the big surprise was that when I realized, I shouldn't say there's a half in that. I thought it was going to be a smaller book. I did not. And, when I was in manuscript length, this is longer than 450, when you're like looking at typed pages. And there were times this got up to 700, right? And so that what I did have this feeling of continuous, going further and further out, because, I as I would write, and I began to see the arc it would take to tell the story I wanted to tell. I was like, oh, that's not finishing in the next X number of pages. And I just was really locked into the kind of story I wanted to tell. And so that was kind of like a death dive. And I got to a point about 2 or 3 years in where I'm just like, I give up. If it's 1,000 pages, I'm going to do it, but nobody's going to want it. But I did know what I wanted. I knew what I was trying to do. I do not map things out. So it's not like I knew how that was going to happen. Mm-hmm. But I did know what I was trying to do. And And I remember one real turning point in the publishing process of the book was saying to somebody who was very much trying to help me in all earnestness, and as I believe everybody around me was, the we know you're trying to make a robust social novel, and we're just trying to help you polish it. And I went, oh my God, no, I'm not. That is absolutely not what I'm trying to make. I see the problem, I am in no way interested in that, and we had talked about like what these 19th century novels are, right? Like, in the terms of what does it look like in this time period? And I know I am not the first to engage in that particular exploration. And then I realized, I remember sitting there and going like, oh, we're talking about totally different 19th century novels. Like, I am not trying to write a novel of manners. I am not trying to write something that's about the, intimate, claustrophobic relationship in a certain social setting of the, Like, and as that's been one of the frustrations of seeing it called domestic fiction. It's just kind of the, but it was a pretty hopeless journey for much of it. And
I am baffled that at any point in this book's conception it could have been mistaken for domestic fiction. That's fascinating to me. I rudely interrupted, but I just wanted to say that because
what I see it listed under most places is domestic fiction, women's divorce fiction.
I would love to write fiction that was categorized as women's divorce fiction. I think maybe
there's one character who's had a past marriage, and
she's a woman. She's been divorced, and it's fiction.
Right, exactly.
But yeah,
I knew I was writing about America through the eyes of these characters. So I knew I was trying to contend with my own deep ambivalence about what it is, what it means, what the possibilities or not are. Again, I don't have the global, I don't have every perspective, and this book does not pretend to contain every perspective. But it is, the intention was a little encyclopedic about certain aspects.
Well, I'm just kind of surprised that you would admit to any ambivalence about America, Vanessa, because I think they're great. I don't know where would the source of this ambivalence come from?
The source of anxiety and desire.
Let's move on to the next question. So, Dennis Johnson is a writer I love a lot. I consider him to be like the poet laureate of fuck-ups. He actually has a link story collection where the character is named Fuckhead.
Yeah.
Like, you give him a real run for his money. Your characters are so wonderfully fucked up, and they do things that are so like disastrously ill-advised, and yet there's so much heart and there's so much nuance into their behavior that you always get that when they act in ways that literally make you just clutch the book tighter and say, "You fool, don't you see what you're doing?" There's just so much beauty that you imbue in bad decisions, I guess is the way I would put it. I would love for you to talk about your philosophy of character, because personally, I enjoy killing characters in fiction. Like, I really get a rise out of it. I just get them out of there. Kill them. And you put them through like something that's even more torturous. Like, you make them live with the consequences of the things that they go through. And I find it fascinating. And I guess I'm asking, like, when you're putting a character that you clearly love and empathize with, and you're kind of living the existence of in a weird way, in a method actory kind of way, like, do you sit back and think, my goodness, what have I done now? Like, what is the psychic toll of that for you, I would ask?
I love a bad decision. I do.
Yeah, I can tell. You can tell. You love it. You love it.
Some of that's personal experience, not just when I say bad decision, I don't mean, to me, a bad decision isn't just like, this is a dumb thing to do. It's also imbued with this incredible philosophical logic that makes it appear to be the only thing to do.
Yeah.
That, and I am fascinated and love.
Futility is something I think you're really into. The futile gesture.
But also the way people respond with life against it. Like
Mhm.
the many like FUs that can come that are shooting yourself in the foot, and at the same time they're a stab at life. You know, they're a stab at some level of you know, freedom in some ways. And I separate that from what you think of with sort of rebellious identity, which I'm not interested in
Yeah.
very much. Like this idea of like, I do this because I'm a rebel. I do that. You know, like, I don't like my characters in my point of view or my way of looking at it. That's not why they do. They do it out of their own nature. They do it honestly and earnestly out of their own nature, not as a you know, and I think that I have a real compassion for those kinds of decisions and for the people who make them. And then you get into situations where it's like everything is so bad. Um, and there maybe isn't a right decision. So okay, let me double back. One of the things that came up in writing and trying to figure out how to make this book what I wanted to try to make it, which was a long learning curve for me, was this question of, you know, you talk about character arc. Here's your character, you know, they meet conflict, things happen, they go through changes, and they develop and become something different than what they are. And part of what I was looking at is like, so how do you write about characters who are doubling down? How do you write about characters who go through all of these things and go like, no, you know, it was mostly right at the beginning. You know what I mean? Like, who like have this kind of, you know, and that was one of the things that I did run into. People's like, I don't see how much they've changed. And it's like, well, they feel different about why they did it. I don't know what to tell you. You know? They do change. It is not true that they don't change. But that sense
But
of
there's nothing so facile as, oh, now I've changed and I've learned something. You're not interested in that.
right, and the questions of repetition, right? Like also, how do you write about the road, right? When the experience of the road is quite often an experience of repetition. And we don't have ways to write about, unless you're extremely experimental, we don't have ways to write about repetition because we tend to press things into symbols and make each a turning post. It comes from film, right? But like part of the actual experience of being on the road, or the like in a very heavy duty way, or like the actual experience of probably being on a tour of duty of anything, is the repetition that's happening that has slight variances, and the pattern recognition that emerges from it, and the ways that time changes because of that, and all of those elements are there, and they don't lend themselves to the novel a lot of times, or they've been hard, you know, I think the sort of way we write doesn't allow a space for them sometimes. So that question of how do you deal with repetition, how do you deal with, you know, why not have one road trip rather than three, was a question I heard about 9 million times. You know, why not have, and it's because you know, that sense that there's always this pressure to condense the idea, and I don't know that I don't like condensing the idea, because I find the permutations of it to be the part that's like, I feel like sometimes like we never get to the story that we could get to because we spend so much time like setting up. And if it depends on where and so that was part of the struggle too, of like the part of the story I was interested in was not the part of the story that, you know, by and large the publishing industry up until recent luck and fortune and help was interested in a lot of ways.
Here's the fun thing about being a writer, being a creative person in any endeavor. Your book is now on the long list for the most, you know, prestigious literary prize in the country, and you stuck to your guns and you made all these decisions that, you know, you had people of good faith telling you were the wrong ones,
Yes.
but you didn't listen and you did what you wanted. And now, you know, I think the book is fantastic. Other people do too. But what fascinates me about writing is that had the book come out and maybe not gotten as much notice and maybe did not make that list, people would have said, oh, she should have listened to all these well-intentioned people telling her how she had to rewrite the book. And it would have gotten into your head too, man, if only I'd done this, this would have happened. So I guess what I'm saying is that what fascinates me about being in our line of work is that there are literally no lessons to draw, because it can go either way, entirely based on stuff that's out of your control. And that is like the fascinating thing about the life to which we have consigned ourselves.
Well, and that's what I mean when I say the story could easily have ended another way. Like,
Yeah.
that's why I don't see it as like, it sounds like a concretized, perfect story. Like, you
Right.
do this, you struggle,
Right.
you you get the reward, and, you're on the list, It could just as easily have been like, I mean, I was looking at like, well, I'm just going to save up and print 1,000 of these, and I'm going to call it good. And that's what I'm going to do. And that's where I was at completely when it took another turn. But like, it could have easily just been that story. So anyway.
I want to talk a bit about these amazing women in your book, Libby and Cheyenne. So I've written cross-gender quite a few times in my own fiction. It's something I think writers should owe it to themselves to do. I think, that attempt is the place where empathy sort of forms, and, you do yourself a disservice if you don't try to imagine your way across these
Right.
boundaries.
I agree.
But I learned things about being a woman in this book. In particular, the unconscious assumption that I think men have that, like, if you're a quote strong woman, you're kind of immune to a lot of the slings and arrows of life. And what I really am genuinely grateful to you for in writing this book was you have these tough, interesting, indefatigable women in your book, and they're kicked and they're dissed and they're terrorized and they're belittled. And I love how you neither shrink from the reality of that, but you also don't aggrandize it. It's kind of just there. It's like this big boulder for these women. And I'm not asking you to make a political speech here, but I wonder if you're aware of, like, political is too strong a word. Let's call it human. Your human responsibility in, like, bringing that news to the world, because these characters are wonderfully compelling people, and yet, man, you showed me something. You really taught me something in this book, and I'm eternally grateful to you for that.
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, I mean, some of that starts from the simple premise that, is one of the reasons I have to admit I'm a little bit, don't want to look a gift horse in the mouth in any way, but like when I see it get filed under women's fiction, there's a long history of what that means and how that sort of separates out fiction. And it's just like, I feel we're right on the cusp of the moment in time where women's fiction will become fiction, at some point, like, where like it's like that, women's rights are human right. It's like, that shouldn't have been a groundbreaking statement, but yet it was and still is in many ways. And so, but I think that writing about women, and so this was one of the things that I think, I had, one of the suggestions I had from a very, very respected editor who meant nothing but good, coming from her perspective, I want you to take the male characters out of the book and just make it about these three women. And, we had this thing that I was always fighting around, which was why all the scope? Why are you talking about history? Why are you talking about, But the part that goes to what you're saying is her viewpoint was that she was trying to make it a more feminist book in her mind, coming from an older second wave feminist perspective. She saw me including those male characters as a way of sort of hiding from being as bold about it. Whereas my perspective was, I don't feel like I have to isolate my characters for them to take center stage. Like, I don't feel like I trust my characters to be strong enough to be able to carry something without having to say, I can't have male presence in the book, because somehow that will do things. And I think that that's something that is generational with some people. I think that there's all different ways to write, gendered experience. And the ways in which I'm most interested in writing about it is to take as a given the reality of what's true for many women, and not make it precious, and not pass it by. And a lot of that comes down to writing the body, like physically, these are characters who, you know, as they move through the world, they have to figure out how to roll their own tampons. They have to figure
Yeah, I was
out
going to say, I didn't even know that was a thing until I read your book.
yeah.
And I asked a couple other women, I was like, is this a thing? They're like, oh yeah, that's a thing. And I was like,
Yeah.
wow.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's
My
also
lifetime of reading, I've never come across rolled your own tampons. You know,
right.
there you
And
go.
there's ways in which they portray, you know, sort of macho-ness to each other.
Mm-hmm.
That is, you know, that is also in the book. That's not, I don't think, them being performatively tough in the way that sometimes we treat tough female characters as being sort of a sense of bravado, a sense
No,
of,
they become like, I've noticed this. Tough women characters in popular entertainment are just surrogate men.
yes,
That's all they are.
yes. Mhm.
And
Yeah,
that's, to me, does an injustice to.
yeah. So, I mean, I don't know. I'm glad that it showed you something that you wanted to look at in your own writing. That's a great compliment. That's an accident on my part. You know, you write and that your writing affects other people. My writing, if people read it and it's for them, it affects them. You know, that's the beauty of that.
You mentioned one of the male characters. One of my favorite characters in the book, this young guy named Essex, who is delightfully fucked up as anyone in the book. And he is a Marine. Yeah, through his eyes, he joins the Marines and goes through boot camp and the torments of that experience. But there's a passage of the book, it's a chapter called Waves of Light, which starts out as this like almost pocket history of the United States Marine Corps, and then turns into this weird psychohistory of John A. Lejeune, the father of the modern Marine. And it takes you through in this really almost Lynchian and impressionistic way, like the history of American foreign policy, and then like lands right on poor Essex, you know, sitting in basic, like trying to contemplate his place in all this. And it's one of the parts of the book that I just like put it down and whistled. And I was like, it's 3.5 pages, but you cover a lot of waterfront in those 3.5 pages. And I could just sense like the deep thought and like really penetrating intellect that you have going into this. And I would like you to read a bit from that section to us if you wouldn't.
Yeah. Okay. This is fun because I never get to read this, you know, section. It's yeah, there are some ghosts in the book. There's Walter Raleigh and John A. Lejeune make an appearance. So, standing at the beachhead, not at all far from the Roanoke River, or even from Hatteras Island, a place of ghosts. Looking east, the ghost of Sir Walter Raleigh is caught in a loop of time. Every night he flees his lost colony and sails for El Dorado, because on the inhale, the Virgin Queen blessed the East Indies Company, and on the exhale, she handed Raleigh a use it or lose it charter for the New World. Go east, young man, go west. Go wherever the hell you want. Behind him, and inland down the North Carolina roads towards Jacksonville, is the Marine Corps base, Camp Lejeune, where thousands of troops skirmish daily. The base is home to the 2nd Marine Division, which was formed on the cusp of the 20th century when a fledgling empire felt the need for a bodyguard. Conceived in the White House, born in the Philippines, schooled in Panama, Cuba, and Guadalcanal, the division provides ground forces to North Africa and the Middle East. Lately, Raleigh has been taken to wearing a wreath of tobacco around his neck and carrying a lock of a blonde child's hair. In the distance, off the North Carolina coast, ship-like factories of whalers head for the Horn. Going deeper and farther out as they approach peak oil, they sail for the Great Offshore Grounds. Barefoot, Raleigh digs his toes into the oily sand. Ankle deep in surf, he whispers his mantra, I am not liable. I am not liable. On the beach around him, Marines practice for night landings on foreign shores. The tidal estuary that partly surrounds Camp Lejeune is considered ideal for training amphibious assault units. Sadly, though, taking the beachhead over and over for 40 years did have unintended costs. The camp's drinking water became poisoned with benzene and engine degreaser, which resulted in birth defects, cancer, and lawsuits. Because while gold cures impotency and alcoholism and poverty, and whales cure machinery and darkness, there is no antidote for benzene poisoning. John A. Lejeune emerges from the sea with the Tuscarora people behind him, first as a crest of a wave and then as a foam on the sand. Raleigh turns into lightning bugs. Lejeune averts his solarium eyes. One, the explorer and brand creator. The other, logistics and deliverables. Having fled north at the founding of the colonies, the local Tuscarora people were gone forever as a force, but not gone forever too. 100 years after the Carolina colony subdivided into North and South, they reemerged in the white imagination as the Union sloop of war, the U.S. Tuscarora. This projection marked a subtle shift in the moral center of the country, repositioning itself outside of the role of proud aggressor into the victimized center of the haunted colonial unconscious. I am not the cowboy, but the Indian. I did not take the hill. That city is not mine. I am not covered in salt. On the eve of the Civil War, the U.S. Tuscarora was sent to intercept the soon-to-be notorious Confederate raider, the CSS Alabama, for which the Alabama Hills would be named, hills now overrun with gladiators and lonely rangers. The order given to the U.S. Tuscarora was simple: sink the CSS Alabama before it crosses the Atlantic. Because who better than the Tuscarora understood the need for this? Who better than they understood the cost of failure? How, if allowed to land, invasive seeds might take hold and colonize an entire garden and become very hard to eradicate later. The Tuscarora did fail, though. The USS Tuscarora did fail, though. It did not stop the CSS Alabama. And the ship, too, then was forced to flee north. Ever returning and re-emerging, though, the sloop later sailed around the Horn to Valparaiso, where it encountered ghosts, mostly the giant Galapagos turtles set on fire by the sailors of the whale ship Essex. The failure of the USS Tuscarora to intercept the Alabama was very likely cheered by John A. Lejeune's father, a devoted Confederate captain, though such things are impossible to know. Perhaps the elder Lejeune's heart was never in the Confederacy, so much as devoted to those whose hearts were, because who will not do things for a person whom they love that they would never do for themselves? Either way, the elder Lejeune's allegiance to the Confederacy did not pass to the next generation. John A. Lejeune, a Marine's Marine, though plantation-born southern son of a Confederate captain, lived and died a defender of the Union. Lejeune served in the Spanish-American War, covering troops in the aftermath of the Battle of San Juan Hill. He fought at the Battle of Guantanamo Bay, establishing Cuba briefly as a U.S. colony. He commanded the Dixie in Panama, and when the United States took over construction of the canal, an opener of doors, the soft speaker, the carried stick, John A. Lejeune. In the summer of 1905, Lejeune remembered the USS Dixie. The USS Dixie was rerouted to assist the French colony in Algeria. They were tasked with helping to set up a scientific station from which they would come to view the total solar eclipse. Lejeune arrived in August. He toured the city of Bonn, which had been the site of a paradigmatic shift of force and brilliance. Grateful that he was there to absorb and not slaughter, he wandered alone. These were the streets of Hippo, where St. Augustine had walked. Augustine, who looked at the expansion and excess of Rome and saw that its destiny was not divine, but a glitch in the narrative of becoming. From the physical realities of the aqueduct and the arches, Augustine constructed a new and holy city set upon a hill, carved in salt and light, but invisible. In the moment before the 1905 eclipse, scientists checked their equipment. They had Algerian servants lay down the bed sheets to catch the shadow bands. Then the eclipse began. The temperature dropped. Stuttering light danced on the linen, and the corona sun was captured with spectroscopes that owed much to Fresnel's theories on waves and light. Such an elegant instrument, the spectroscope, only a prism, a couple of mirrors and a slit in a box, yet able to reveal the elements in complex radiation. For this reason, it is often used in classrooms to demonstrate spectrometry. The experiment is simple. Take a candle that's been used before, put sodium chloride in the well by a burnt wick, then look at it burn through a spectroscope. In the dark, a single bright yellow line will appear, also made of salt and light.
So this is a passage that takes us from, literally from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. You get the American colonial experience with Walter Raleigh depicted as the pirate he was. You even take us into Christian apologetics and the justification of colonialism and the weird shit that happens to cultures that feel like they're under siege. It's just such a bravura passage, and you pack so much into it. To me, like, if the book were only that, that would be great. But it's not only that, it's also this incredibly human story about people, you know, and you pause for these moments that to me, that makes it the imaginative achievement that it is. So thank you for reading that. That was great.
Thanks for letting me nerd out with a section that nobody.
Well, it's the section the title literally comes from. It obviously means something important to you, right?
It does. It does.
John, would we like to open it up to questions now? Would that be good?
If anybody has any.
If anybody has any, if not, we'll just keep shooting the bull, as they say here on the farm.
We have one question, and then I'll while I ask it, I will encourage all of those who are watching. If you have any questions, you can feel free to ask them. This is from our friend Donovan. Vanessa, you've written about the tradition of the American road novel and its dearth of female protagonists. Is that one way you thought of this novel, writing the kind of road narrative you were missing as a reader?
Yeah, I think in some ways, although I didn't start out with that in mind. I think that one of the things for me as a writer that happened in the, I used to hear, actually, Tom, both you and Donovan will know this. I used to frequently hear from people when they would read Zazen or they would read, in long form stuff, they would say, like, I can't believe it's the same writer. A lot of times I would hear people say like this, I would never have picked out that this was the same writer. And I think some of that is just depends on where you posit your idea of authorial voice. To me, it's something about like what the aesthetic and moral ethical concerns of the writer are is voice to me, and that can be displayed in a sort of polyphonic way, in different kinds of settings. But I also think that this was the novel where I took both sides of that and pulled them closer together in a lot of ways. And so in doing that, I did not expect to be writing about the road as, something that was sort of as much of a feature of the book as it came to be. But as the characters began to travel, and they were traveling without money in a very sort of itinerant way, degenerate way, a lot of times, I have a lot of experience and confidence writing in that territory. And then I think when that came up, I was like, oh, well, I get to write about it the way I think it should be written about, which was just don't explain, you have to explain the money, right? And explaining the money was really the explainer that led to the. So, Donovan, this stuff you're talking about a lot is this question of how people don't allow women to take up quest, right? And that, I think the quote that went around a lot from that was, a man on the road is solitary, a woman on the road is alone, that there's no solitary consciousness, that, there's an experience there that you would have respect. It's like she's either shunned or there's something wrong with her, or, or like, she's escaping, violent. I mean, like there's death. There's no freedom. There's just death and danger, or you're crazy, or you're doing it to yourself. Like there is not a space for women traveling in a lot of ways from the eye of the beholder, not from the woman themselves or the person. And so with that, I think that I got to write some of the way I wanted to write about it, just because the characters were established enough in the first chapters that it made sense for why they were doing what they did. I think also, though, the money thing allowed it to be, to just get in the detail of like getting from point A to point B. And I know that was frustrating early on and with the novel too, with people's like, we get it. Like, hurt as if it was in the way of the plot. And I think that's some of the story of class and writing about class is like money, the details of how people work or what they do or don't work, or like all of the things that they may have to make trades on. That's not in the way of the plot for like 90% of the world. That is the plot. Like that's how you get through day after day, And so, the road parts, I think, came up naturally. I had not thought, although there is one journey where I just had fun with it. And I think I was very much just enjoying, a run of bad luck and bad decisions that felt very believable to me. So I did get a chance to write about it, but I didn't take that on early in the project and had not thought of it that way as much. Although Donovan was my editor along with Mike Benoit on the Truck Stop Killer piece. And, there was a conversation in that where I came out of that feeling like that was one side of the experience. And there's this other side of the experience too. That's very, very different from that. And so I did, I think Livy got some of that in the book, honestly. Anyway, I don't know if there are other questions. I don't know if I answered that too fully or not enough.
Well, Tom, not to put you on the spot, but we don't have any other questions from our viewers just yet. So if there's other things that you wanted to touch on, otherwise you're just left with me asking very boring generic.
Vanessa, I'm someone who in fiction I tend to research it a lot.
Okay, yeah.
And I like research. I like becoming conversant enough with a subject to convince other people that they're, holding the rifle as Essex is taking it apart and cleaning it. I was super impressed with how much you learned about tall ships, how much you learned about the reality of a young Marine recruit. Roxane Gay said something on Goodreads, which I thought was amazing, which is that this book really understands the reality of poverty, which I thought was a very wise thing to say, because it really does. Money is a thing. And I've, traveled a lot in my life, and when you run out of money, it's genuinely terrifying when you're on the road. And I love how you didn't shirk from that. You incorporated it into the plot. So I think the money, poverty, on the run stuff, that's all coming out of your lived experience. And I trust you on that stuff implicitly as a writer. But I'd love to hear you talk about just the crazy shit you did to understand what life on an Alaskan tall ship is like, what it's like for a young man to join the Marines. Like, how did you approach that? What was your method?
Well, first, let me ask you a question. Did you find it convincing? Your dad was a Marine. You've written about the Marines. You've been around Marines.
Super convincing. Absolutely convincing.
Good. Okay.
Absolutely convincing.
That's great.
Yeah,
I
didn't question at all. And even there may be stuff like, I'm not a Marine, obviously. I would last about 3 nanoseconds in the Marines, but like you say, I read a lot about them. There was nothing in it that didn't feel like that it was intensely observed, and like, Essex was going through that shit in my head. I never felt like you pulling strings or anything.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, the two areas that I had to, there were versions of my, so you talked about research as something that, you want to make other people feel like they can trust you on the subject. Whereas I approach research in some ways, I want to make myself feel like I can write with some freedom. And so that's the degree to which research comes in for me. And for me to do that, I have to really immerse myself and go down a lot of rabbit holes for me to feel like, okay, I kind of know.
Could I stop you for 1 second? I have a vivid memory. It's just a few years ago. We saw each other and you pulled out this like sailing book with all these star charts in it. And you were like, look how fantastic this is. And it was fantastic, but I have to admit, after like 2 or 3 minutes, I was like, yeah, this is really cool. But you're like, you don't understand, you were so into it. And reading this book, I now realize that's why she went so bananas for this book back then, because you were just in it.
Yeah.
You were in this world. And that was an important thing for you to have found.
And that book is, well, anyway, I won't nerd out on that. So there was also things like there was a period, and this is one of those things that didn't really end up that much in it. It was for an alternate, path I was looking at. But I remember I got the, why am I drawing a blank? The military, the main military legal manual is the Military Justice, the Unified Manual of Military Justice.
Sure.
Okay. It's like 1,400 pages, and like it has like every, so I was tracing all of these things because there was a version in which Essex actually went overseas, and I was tracing a lot of command structure stuff about what happens if X happens, right? Like, and who rules on this under which circumstances. So then I found that there was a guy who was really high up in the 2nd Marines who was now in private practice at some point, had retired out of 30 years and was a lawyer. He was a JAG. Well, they're not JAGs. I found they're JAs in the Marines, but like, and he was, and I just called him out of the blue and like said, hey, I really want to talk to you about some things, and got like, I would just ask and pigeonhole anybody at the top level I could find them with my weird stories and say like, well, what about this? Well, what about that? You know, and whether it was the harbor master in Sitka, you know, when I was talking about some of the things that happened in that harbor, the tall ship stuff, it wasn't, I put the tall ship in Alaska in the novel, but, you know, the fishing boat stuff, a lot of that, I mean, I knew a little bit about fishing and I lived in Southeast Alaska for a period of time, you know, at various times in my life. But a lot of that came from my friend Kirsten, who was also fishing and had fished out there for a long time. And so I was talking to her throughout and asking questions because like I knew what I needed for the story. And then I just would, you know, a lot of research on exactly what kinds of, you know, just boats, length limits, and then having to write your way in a different, I mean, I went way down a hole on IFQs and that whole thing got cut out. It's, you know, about like these kind of inherited fishing sustainability things that were sort of a carryover from the 60s in Alaska and like tended to go with like, you know, mostly native claims and nobody needs to know about that. But like, so I have all this extraneous stuff, but with the tall ship, I was stuck because I wasn't going to write it as a tall ship. I just knew that Livy had to sail without electronics at some point, and I knew that that was going to happen.
Oh, so that's fascinating. So a plot constraint forced you into this almost unwelcome area of research that you were like, well, I guess I got to fucking do this now because the plot necessitated a tall ship away from the world.
It didn't. The tall ship came after. So I went to work. I was talking to a friend. He worked on the tall ship, and I said, I need to figure out how to write about what it means to sail without electronics. And he said, well, I did it a lot. I used to work on a tall ship. And he said, why don't you try to go see if you can do a sail trainee program or something? And I was like, well, I don't have any money and they cost money. And I looked at the boat that he had been on and I was like, their season has already started. It costs money I don't have. And I used my writing skills and I wrote a letter and I was like, dear sir, you know, I have no money. I would really like to come work on your boat. I realize that the season has already started, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I'm fairly useless and I'm twice as old as everybody.
Jesus Christ. And you got it.
Yeah. And he said, can you be in Green Bay in 2 days? And I said, yeah. And then he sent me all this paperwork that was about how I would die. Like, it was like I had to sign off on all the different ways. They had actually spelled out all the ways. Like, they really wanted to bring them. But so I went and I worked for almost a month on the U.S. brig Niagara, which is an 1813. It's got 14 sails. It's got like, I think like 198 lines belayed to deck. Like, it's a very intense boat. It was the ship that saved that helped draw the Canadian-U.S. border. And it does reenactments occasionally, but it's the flagship of the state of Pennsylvania, and its home port is Erie. And it was a very, you know, solid, amazing, very intense, very authentic in many ways, you know, ship. And it was from seeing one that I was able to extrapolate out and write one that was like, shouldn't
That's
be
a Russian one, yeah.
You know, that was like owned by an oligarch who should not be sailing. It's like floating around like junk. But it was the, you know,
I just want to single out, it was a very intense boat as the takeaway quote from this from this conversation. It was a very intense boat.
And I will say one last thing about the research part with it. I'm not a tall ship sailor. I'm not, you know, I worked on the ship. I worked as hard as I could. I learned a whole bunch, and I'm sure it was insufficient. But I did, what I realized when I came back at first when I was writing, I was like, oh my God, I don't know how to was very nervous about, because I came back and I was like, oh, the only thing I actually know how to write about now is tall ships, not
not the actual ship the majority of the book takes place on.
Right.
Yeah.
So with that boat, I know we're, you know, hitting our mark here, but with that tall ship, what I realized, and this, I would say this for any writer who, you know, who's new to thinking about how they relate to research, is I made the mistake when I first started writing the tall ship sections of thinking like, okay, I was thinking of sail commands. I was thinking of like, how does this sail? So I was thinking of it from a captain's point of view. I'm not a captain. That's not anything I'm ever going to be able to do. And it's not the character's need. What you need is the physicality. And I realized I knew what I needed to know, which is I know when I go aloft and I go out on the yard for a particular, you know what I mean? Like, I know what's physically there. Like, I know what's near me. And like most of your writing within a 6-foot frame, like when you're writing scene. And so much of what you pick up is the language. The language of cell commands is fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
And
you were the first person that I ever heard why everything is weirdly shortened is because you want to be able to hear it when you're shouting it in a storm. And I was like, oh, that's fascinating. That's another little tidbit I'm so grateful to you for having learned. So yeah.
So that's my point of view on research, is that like you think you need all these details, but to me it's so you can throw them out and you can understand your physical space. Your characters are grounded in that physical space in a believable way.
That is advice.
Maybe the tall ship sailors will hate it.
Yeah. Yeah. John, are you shutting us down? Are you shutting this party down?
No, there's one last question I think I should ask, and it's a fitting last question to leave us on. The question asker asks, unrelated to anything you've discussed, but I'd love to hear if there was a moment of pure joy when the kernel of the story came to you, i.e., as torturous as the process can be, what joy did this book bring you that is most memorable?
A friend of mine who had read it and had also read my first book had said, it's so strange. Zaza, he said, if you write down everything that happens in this novel, it's darker than Zazen, But he said, but it feels so much lighter. And I knew what it was, which was it's the love in the book between the characters. And when I set out to write this, one of the things I said was, I asked myself before I started writing at all, what are you afraid to write? And I'm afraid to write about love. I'm afraid to write. I just don't know how. I don't know how to make it feel right about it in a way I can care to discuss, you know what I mean, in a certain way. And so I think that there were times where I could just feel the love between the characters and that other thing that I didn't know how to put into something. And so there were moments when I could see it and could see that I had been able to put it in there. And those were moments of joy for me.
And it is a book filled with love. And it's the thing I admire about it the most, because the energy of literature is the same energy of love to me. Yeah.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks for doing this with me. Thanks everybody who came.
Thank you all. Thank you both for being here this evening at Home with Literati. We appreciate it so much. You can purchase the Great Offshore Grounds from Literati. I just put a link one more time in the chat. It was just longlisted for the National Book Award. Vanessa Veselka, Tom Bissell.
Wait, please. Before we go.
Literati!
Thank you for representing. We appreciate it so much.
I'll order a shirt and send $5. Thanks for having me.
No, we'll send you a shirt. But we also hope to see you in the store sometime soon, perhaps when things return to whatever state that's not quite normal, but close to it, we come back to. So thanks again for joining us, and we'll hope to see you at the next event, and continue to stay safe and take care. And thanks everybody else, and have a good night.